Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it a couple minutes for people to join, but as you join, please type into the chat box your name and where you're joining us from today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it one more minute and then we will begin. All right. Happy Friday, everybody. And thank you again for joining us for our Friday Digest series. For those of you who are first timers, we're thrilled to have you here. And for those who have joined us before, welcome back. I am Jason All, Director of Strategic Communications here at Maryland LCV. Today begins the official celebration for Maryland Day 2024, which is a time where we commemorate our state's rich history and cultural heritage. Throughout our conversation today, we're going to take a pretty robust look at the work that we're doing and how it's directly impacting how we can protect and cherish our shared heritage through our environment, which is something that has sustained communities in this region for thousands of years. If you've joined us before, you know our goal with these Friday Digests is to provide you with the information, tools, and resources to be an informed and active advocate. Being with us for our weekly digest speaks to the power of our community and to your commitment to these solutions. We also want these agendas for these virtual meetings to be driven by your interests. So please let us know what you want to hear for future Friday Digest. There will also be a survey at the end of the session that you're free to fill out, just a couple questions that'll help us really build out a good program in the months ahead. As you join, please type your name into the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And as we move through our half hour together, please type any questions or comments into either the Q&A section of Zoom or into the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as we can before we're over today. Before we dive into the session, I want to sort of set the stage for what we'll be covering today. We'll be discussing how our community and those working hard to safeguard Maryland's environment are in turn helping safeguard Maryland's heritage, something we are proud to celebrate every year on Maryland Day. I'm thrilled to be joined by Nell Zeal, Chief for the Office of Planning, Education, and Outreach of the Maryland Historical Trust, as well as my colleague, Kristen Harbison, our Political Director. Before we begin, I want to emphasize the importance of how close we are to the end of the legislative session. Crossover only happened a few days ago, which I was reminded because it felt like it was a week ago at this point, but things are moving very fast, which we love to keep things moving. The crossover is a period in which each chamber votes out bills for the opposing chamber to consider. The bills that make it through this process have a much higher likelihood of becoming law. So these next few weeks are really crunch time, and in many ways, an all hands on deck period for our entire community. There are a number of issues we'll be discussing today that, with your support, we have an amazing chance of passing through the Maryland General Assembly before the session is up on April 8th. The work we do, while important, pales in comparison to the impact that you can make as an individual. Your representatives are in Annapolis to represent you and your interests. You can make very quick and decisive action today by signing on to our action alerts on our priority legislation, the links of which will be shared throughout the program today in the chat box. With that, I am very thrilled to kick things off and start with a question for Nell. First, Nell, thank you so much for joining us for a Friday Digest. Starting on the whole topic of Maryland Day, can you share with us the significance of Maryland Day and why it's important to celebrate and honor the state's rich history and cultural heritage?
Sure. Thank you. And Thank you for inviting me today. Again, my name is Nell. I work for the Maryland Historical Trust, which is the state agency for historic preservation and archaeology in Maryland. So I'm going to give you a little perspective from where I sit on some of these issues. Maryland Day commemorates March 25th, 1634, when about 130 settlers disembarked from two sailing ships, the Ark and the Dove, onto St. Clement's Island. They landed on what is now St. Mary's County in Maryland, authorized by the English charter to Cecilius Calvert, who was the Baron of Baltimore. About half of the settlers were Catholics and about half were Protestants. And so the arrival of these ships is important in the broader European focus story of religious tolerance in Maryland and the legacy there, and anti-Catholic sentiment at the time. The Ark also likely transported Mateus de Sousa, who was the first known free man of African descent to settle in Maryland. He came over as an indentured servant to Jesuit priests. He's long been thought to be a Catholic, but he may have been a Sephardic Jew, which is interesting. In 1641, he was elected as representative at the Maryland Assembly meeting, possibly making him the first Black man to participate in an English colony legislature. And of course, on arrival, the colonists encountered the indigenous peoples who already lived here, including the Piscataway Conoy, who historically and currently as the Piscataway Indian Nation and the Piscataway Conoy tribe, both of which are recognized by the state. They had a very different perspective on the arrival. So I think Maryland Day is a really good example of the layers and dissonance, in some cases within cultural memory, the importance of understanding all of those perspectives and the complexity at any point in space and time. Maryland Day was instituted in 1903, and at that point, it was no doubt a very straightforward celebration focused on European conquest. As it's evolved, we recognize that the stories are a lot more nuanced, and it's incumbent on us to lift up all of those voices and to really ask as many questions as we can. And you'll see that, I think, as you see some of the commemorations around the state. And that is one of the reasons why we've sort of transitioned from calling this a day of celebration to a day of commemoration in many cases, because it does have a complex history. So I hope that answers your question, and we can
It
talk a
does.
little bit more about some of the heritage issues.
Thank you so much. It was a really good overview of the history of Maryland Day. Though to bring it back to the top of the conversation, can you discuss the connection between historical preservation and environmental conservation? Obviously, that's very important for the state's history and our environment, our waterways have sustained many people here for so long. How these two areas of focus intersect.
Great. So thanks for asking this question. This is an issue of special importance to me. So I have a background in both archaeology and historic preservation, and I've worked in land conservation organizations as well. So I sort of take the long view and a philosophical view on some of these issues. The separation of cultural heritage from the natural world is an artificial one. It derives, again, from a very European-centric perspective on the separation of people from nature. And a lot of cultures don't make that distinction. And for most of our existence, our sustenance, which included our building materials, our building forms, everything that we contributed to the landscape and interacted with on the land and the water, our ways of life were completely intertwined with the natural systems around us. And that was true for most of our existence, right, for thousands of years. And now we're in the Anthropocene, looking at a natural world that we have shaped from top to bottom. We've impacted everything from the atmosphere to the water to plastic bits on mountain peaks, right? And so when you look at historic preservation and what that means, we are very focused on the built environment, on the physical remnants of human interaction with the land. And I think it's important to understand that even though these concepts and professional fields are separated, there is a lot of interaction because there really isn't that much of a difference. In practice, in my profession, we have a concept called cultural landscapes, for example, that attempts to sort of bridge the gap professionally, which allows us to identify and protect larger scale landscapes that humans have shaped and or which have accrued cultural meaning and significance over time. So for example, the Harriet Tubman landscape in Dorchester County was critical to the survival of people who had self-emancipated and were fleeing slavery on the Eastern Shore. So how they used the waterways and tree cover, et cetera, to escape was essential. The landscapes, those same landscapes are also important to the indigenous peoples of the Eastern Shore as well. So you get this layering, and Blackwater, which overlaps with the Tubman landscape, is a national wildlife refuge and has, many important ecological features as well. So those things are all interconnected. And I think we are in our different fields sort of getting to a place where we're recognizing that a little bit more, but we still have some work to do. At the end of the day, what we're really talking about is, when we talk about historic preservation and environmental conservation, it's what kind of an environment do we want to live in? What's healthy, what's good for us, what's good for the ecological systems that sustain us, what do we want to remember, how should humans be interacting with the world, and are there things we can learn from our past? So a lot of cultures, including, some of our own, have legacies of, stewardship was an important cultural value in many places and in many communities. And environmental stewardship is very much a part of that. So I think understanding how those things are connected is going to be really important for us going forward. And we can start now.
Well, I appreciate that, especially as someone who's relatively new to Maryland, to hear about that intersection here. Though you did touch on this a little bit, I want to get to this next question. In what ways does understanding our historical and cultural heritage contribute to building a more equitable, just, and sustainable future for Maryland?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about those layers of cultural memory and inclusion. You can protect cultural memory without protecting the associated places, but it's usually a much richer experience and allows people to feel those connections, to understand those connections, to meditate on them, and for other layers to emerge. So we might have protected a place for, one set of cultural significance, and then, discover later that there are these other layers that we need to interpret, and we can have a dialogue within that space. Practically, historic communities have physical properties and craftsmanship that make them desirable places to live and work. Everyone deserves beauty, and we have some unbelievable historic communities that developed under the suffering of segregation, for example. I'm thinking right now of some historic Black and Jewish neighborhoods where I live in Baltimore City that have suffered from decades of disinvestment because of racism. But people are still there, and we can shift our priorities to better invest in those communities and to keep people in their homes and to keep those neighborhoods thriving. So I think there's more we can do to help in that regard. Historic communities often accommodate a range of economic classes by design, and they can move us away from that single-use subdivision cookie cutter model that we've been really focused on and that has dominated the past several decades. And they're built typically to facilitate walking and other forms of transportation before cars, So again, reinvesting in those communities helps limit sprawl as well. And you have that benefit of cultural memory, in addition to all of those factors that helps us to sort of wrestle with our past and chart a new future, hopefully. So for all those reasons, I think historic preservation has an important role to play, and intersects as well with a lot of the work that you all are doing.
So how does the Maryland Historical Trust engage with diverse communities across the state to make sure that preservation and interpretation of Maryland's history is both inclusive and representative?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we, in many cases, facilitate local planning efforts. And so we will, fund or otherwise support local priorities and organizations that are, in many cases, automatically more diverse and complex than what we're looking at the state level. We are actively working on this in terms of the structure of our programs and what we are investing in. We've traditionally been focused on a very Eurocentric model for history and preservation for most of our existence, and we know that. Over the many years that we have partnered with the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture to administer the African American Heritage Preservation Program, we've developed strong partnership there, and that program was recently boosted from $1 million to $5 million for capital projects for African American heritage around the state. So that's a really important way that the state is working to support Black history specifically. We have also, my agency has solicited federal funding to support the documentation of Asian American culture, especially in the DC metro area and in Baltimore City. And we've partnered with local communities to do that. With Preservation Maryland, which is our statewide nonprofit, we and just to be clear, not my agency's nonprofit, they are their own independent organization, but they serve the state for historic preservation and cultural heritage. We collaborated on a statewide historic context study on LGBTQ history, which is one of two that exist in the country. The other one is in Kentucky, weirdly, to me, but we were happy to be among the first to do that. And we do partner with Maryland's tribal communities, particularly on archaeology projects and also interpretive projects. And if you're interested in seeing where we're headed along these lines, we have a lot that's outlined in our recently completed statewide preservation plan. We are mandated to produce a statewide historic preservation plan that includes not just our agency, but everyone who's working on historic and cultural heritage throughout the state, to set goals, objectives, and strategies for that work every few years. That's part of our mandate from the National Park Service. So we have outlined where we'd like to focus over the next 8 years, and I can put a link in the chat after I'm done talking if anyone is interested in taking a look at that. We just got that approved.
Perfect. And we'll make sure to share that link around when we send a follow-up email to everyone who's attended today.
Thank you.
One more question for you before I pass it along to Kristen. It's actually kind of a two-parter because we got a question in the chat that is somewhat related as well. But how can Marylanders get involved in preserving and celebrating the state's history and heritage? In particular, how areas that might be affected by climate change. And I would love to hear what resources the Maryland Historical Trust offers to support general preservation and celebration of the state's history and heritage.
Okay, so I think for most people, preservation is local. So people tend to get involved with their local community organizations. In Baltimore City, for example, we have Baltimore Heritage, which is a great nonprofit. And those nonprofits are usually the ones that organize for advocacy at the local level about, places that you care about. Preservation Maryland, as I mentioned, is the statewide nonprofit that is advocating for historic preservation more broadly. So those are ways to get involved, but you can also tour historic sites, learn about Maryland history. If you have a historic property, invest in that. And you can follow us. I believe there's a link to our contact information, our Facebook, etc. We have opportunities for archaeology, public programming, and things like that if you're interested. So there are many ways to get involved. Again, for most people, it's close to home. Excuse me. We offer financial incentive programs to help a lot of these local activities. We have rehabilitation tax credits for both commercial investment and also home ownership. So if you own a historic property and want to invest in that, you should check out the state rehab tax credit. We also have a lot of grants available. I mentioned the African American Heritage Preservation Program. We have other kinds of capital grants, so bricks and mortar investment funds. We offer loans. We have a heritage area, the Maryland Heritage Areas Program, which invests in heritage tourism programs and activities around the state. So a lot of the things that you see connected to Maryland Day in many cases will be supported either by a Maryland Heritage Area and or our funding streams there. So I'm happy to share any information about financial incentives. But those are some of the ways that that we support those activities statewide. And I'm sorry, you had another question about climate change. I think that was part of that.
Well, thinking about it now, I actually might be a great time to ask Kristen that question. Which I apologize in advance, Kristen. This is going to be kind of a big question here. But
I'm ready for you.
given what Nell has talked about, how do you see our legislative priorities supporting these efforts?
Yeah, and I should say one of the things, so I actually came to the environmental space from historic preservation. I've known Nell for a long time. I met when I worked 100 years ago at Preservation Maryland. And immediately, and before coming to Annapolis, working in Annapolis, I worked for the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers, and where I started to work a lot with the idea of sustainable buildings. So my transition to working in environmental policy was natural. So I bring that background to the work that we do in terms of helping to make sure that we're building holistic programs, considering all the different partners that we can be looking at, because I really fundamentally believe that you can't really have environmental conservation with historic preservation are two parts of the same coin. It's not even two sides of the same coin. It is all of a piece. And so they absolutely build against each other and are required to work against each other. So a lot of the things that we do, and one of the reasons I was so excited to have Nell join us is that, the work that we do helps support the resiliency of these historic communities which are facing sea level rise, that are, we are looking at, especially on the 250,000 acres of Maryland that is less than 5 feet above sea level, mostly on the eastern shore in southern Maryland, right? That's a real threat for them. And a lot of those historic communities were built right next to the water. And so they are the most threatened by sea level rise. And so by doing the work that we're doing on climate change, we're actually supporting the protection of our communities, and we're spending a lot of time. So one of the bills that we've been highlighting this year has been the Whole Watershed Act, which one of the pieces of that is, in addition to protecting the bay and our waterways, it's also working with local communities to build their resilience. So there's that connection, and we're working on, trying to moving from the shore to the built environment. The Brighter Tomorrow Act is another bill that we've talked about that is working on incentivizing solar development in areas that are already developed. So we're looking at places where we can be supporting our existing communities with solar, rooftops where it's appropriate, solar solar canopies over parking lots to help support those communities and make the already built communities more supportive, finding ways to revitalize and support existing communities. That's what the Brighter Tomorrow Act does, which again incentivize these projects, which are harder and more expensive for these companies to build, and helps to bring that there to help support, again, to make the rural land, help support the rural legacy, the rural heritage by bringing that development. It will be, there will be solar development in rural areas as well, but we want to make sure that it can also happen closer to the communities and to help protect the rural areas. We spent a lot of time in terms of looking at ideas about solar siting and figuring out how we can work with our rural communities and our agricultural communities, because agricultural preservation is also a huge part of Maryland's heritage. And figuring out, making sure that those communities are nurtured and developed and supported as well through the work that we're doing. So I really don't think that anything we can do can happen without all of that. It needs to be all of a piece. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that this is, I think, everything that we do supports historic preservation in ways that are direct or indirect.
That's wonderful, because there's there's a lot going on, a lot we're doing to work to preserve Maryland's heritage. But I actually think this dovetails pretty good into another question, especially important for those who have joined us today. Are there any actions that those on our call today, or those who may be receiving an email today, could take to help move some of these issues forward?
Yeah, and and there's the talking, and I'll just put in the chat about the archaeological sites being especially threatened, and those are fragile and remarkable, and we need to make sure that we're protecting those too. So you're always going to hear from us about the ways you can support. As you mentioned at the beginning, we have but 2 short weeks left of legislative session, and everything that we've got through the first 70 days through the first chamber, we need to do exactly the same thing in the next chamber, in a much more compressed time frame. So reaching out to your legislators to say to support these important bills that we're working to pass. And I mentioned 2, but there are certainly others. Help us get through. Contact your legislators, tell them to support the Brighter Tomorrow Act. That one actually has an additional hurdle because it didn't, what we call, make crossover. It didn't pass one chamber before Monday. And so it has to go through another step to get to the final passage. It can still happen. There's a lot of commitment to do it, but they need to know that it's important. And so call your legislators, we have our action alerts, take those actions. It matters. It matters to legislators to hear from their constituents that what we're doing is important, that you believe in it, that they should be believing in it too. And they need to do whatever they need to do to prioritize these programs with all the demands that they're facing. And so those action alerts are really important. There are, in addition to the ones that we've talked about, there are the Better Buildings Act is a really important bill that we haven't actually even talked about on this, which helps with electrification, supporting again the communities, the existing infrastructure, and electrifying it to make our built environment more sustainable. And we can find the information around that as well. Like there are so many things that you do, and what we need is you to be engaging with your legislators actively, to let them know it's important.
Kristen, thank you so much. It's crazy how quickly these Friday Digest sessions conclude. We're almost at the 30-minute mark, which is wild to me. So I want to first take the time. Nell, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for your insight. Kristen, thank you again as well. To our audience, thank you for joining us and your support of our work. If you have any questions that weren't answered today, you can always send them to us by email, and someone from our team will get back to you. And just to reiterate what Kristen said, before you leave, that we only have a couple short weeks left. And as you can imagine, our whole community is focused on getting these things across the finish line before the session is up. And I guess to that end, I kind of say, please don't be a stranger. We're here to be a resource as well. If you have any questions about some of these issues, we are happy to answer them, whether it be by text, email, or carrier pigeon. You name it, we'll be there. But thank you so much for joining us. Please fill out a quick 5-question survey, which will be shared in the chat if it hasn't already. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks
everybody.
for having me.